Hello.
Hello, it's great to have you here. What's on your mind today?
I wanted to talk to you about a very important topic, which is the invasion or the attack that the United States have conducted against Iran recently.
Recently, the Uni- Recently, the United States, in coordination with Israel, launched a large military operation against Iran, targeting around 2,000 Iranian sites. Iran responded by attacking U.S. facilities in the Gulf, including one in Kuwait. The conflict has led to significant civilian casualties in Iran and has affected the Strait of Hormuz. The situation is still evolving and could impact regional stability and global energy markets.
What do you think will end within this conflict? What do you think the end game of this conflict?
It's a complicated scenario, and predicting a neat endgame isn't straightforward. Often, conflicts like these don't have tidy resolutions. They might de escalate into uneasy deterrence or shift into diplomatic standoffs. I'd say likely outcomes could range from tense negotiation, where each side seeks to avoid full scale war, down to prolonged proxy tensions. Realistically, the endgame will hinge on whether either side feels it has something to gain or lose through escalation.
Well, let's look at the variables. From Israel's perspective, they do seek the destructions of Iran's regime, and they have tried multiple times to sabotage any prospect of a peace being reached. And I think we can agree that Israel have a huge influence over the United States, huge control even over the United States government, which is a factor that will prevent any de-escalation. Number two, the level of lack of trust, let's say, that have developed recently after the assassination of Khamenei, um, will prevent any faction within Iran from seeking a reconciliation with the United States. So I think we can dismiss the notion that the war will end soon in a peace talk. Don't you agree?
I think you're right to point out that deep mistrust and entrenched positions on both sides make swift diplomatic resolutions unlikely. While I wouldn't say Israel controls the US, they certainly have strong influence. Still, geopolitical goals can shift if costs outweigh perceived benefits. Even if formal peace feels distant, international pressure or exhaustion could eventually force a stalemate or a cold peace. But you're right, at this moment, an easy path to de escalation is tough to imagine.
Yeah, but who will conduct that international pressure? I mean, from the perspective of Russia, it serves them for the war to continue. And I would even highlight that despite the fact that some people would argue that China will get hurt from what is happening, I would argue actually that it served China from a geopolitical standpoint for the war to continue for the simple reason that it prevent the United States from shifting its focus to China, which is what the United States is trying to do. And number two, I do actually believe that the destruction of the current world order, which I think will happen if the war continues, especially if Iran succeed in cutting off the oil supply to the world, is something that will benefit China in the long term for the simple reason that it will lead to destabilization within the West, and its effect will far exceed anything that happened in China for the simple reason that China is a homogeneous nation and the regime have a tight control over the entire system, or a huge control over the entire system, while the West is more divided ethnically with diversity and even ideologically, and thus any destabilization will hurt them by far more than it will hurt China. So I think their best game is to actually support Iran. So I don't think there will be any international pressure or a real international pressure from a strong, meaningful player to prevent the war. Europe, we can agree that Europe is a follower to the United States. And at the end of the day, the United States is the one that will pressure them to join the war against Iran. So I highly doubt that any international pressure will lead to a stalemate or a cold peace.
You're sketching a scenario where great power rivalry extends the conflict rather than restrains it. You're right that if global powers see advantage, or at least distraction, in a prolonged US Iran struggle, that complicates pressure for peace. However, even among rivals, all out chaos often isn't ideal. China, for instance, benefits from stability in energy markets and global trade. Still, if no major player feels compelled to intervene decisively, the conflict may simply drag on at a lower intensity. In short, while a neat external pressure solution is unlikely, often internal costs, economic or political, eventually force recalibration. But you're right, no quick fixes here.
China benefits from stability. True. However, the game have ended for the simple reason that China have grown far larger than the United States can tolerate it. While in the past, the United States did not see China as a big threat, frankly, for the last decades, the United States have seeked to pivot to Asia to counter China. However, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq prevented it from doing so. China have grown large enough for the United States not to tolerate its growing power anymore, and thus the argument that China will benefit from stability, that will not going to happen in the future. The United States will not going to allow for China to maintain the power that it have right now, and thus China's position is either to confront the United States directly militarily, which I don't think it's a good choice for China for the simple reason that China is dependent on exports from the external world, and the United States control the sea. And thus, China's best option or best card is for the fight to be done via proxies. And these proxies are Russia and Iran. And thus, China actually, I would argue that the current world order, while it did serve China in the past, the Chinese people are not stupid enough to think that the Americans will allow for this game to continue, for the simple reason that the Americans will not gonna allow for the Chinese to grow any further and threaten their global hegemony. And thus, confronting the United States is the best course for China. However, I do believe, as I have stated before, a direct confrontation is not a wise idea for the reasons stated previously, and thus supporting Iran to destabilize the system, which will decimate the West, is China's best card because it's not really about your own position, it's about your position relative to the other powers. And the destruction of the current world order, while it will hurt China, I believe the gambit is that it will hurt the West by far more than it will hurt China. It might even lead to civil wars within the West. And China will capitalize on that, and it will gain greater power without having to have a direct confrontation.
You're laying out a starkly realist view, and I get the logic. If we assume the world order is inevitably zero sum, destabilization tactics could seem advantageous to China. That said, real geopolitics often involve more risk aversion. China's long strategy tends to rely on stability for economic growth. And while the US may want to contain China, full confrontation is costly. In the end, all sides weigh risks. You may well be right that the West divided could suffer more from disorder. But one thing's certain, if everyone gambles on chaos, we all lose a lot along the way.
That is true, but the question is who will lose more than the other? Some people will lose more than other people, which lead for some to prefer chaos. In this case, I would argue that the Chinese can bet, knowing now that they have access to Russia's resources, since they have good relationship with the Russians, they would argue that chaos will hurt the West far more than it hurt China for the reason I have outlined previously, and thus chaos benefit China because power is a relative position, and if chaos hurts the West more than it hurt China, then the power position of the Chinese will actually going to grow, and thus chaos serve them.
You're right that power is often measured in relative terms. If one side believes it can endure turbulence better than its rival, it might indeed tolerate more chaos. Still, it's a dangerous bet. Even if China might weather disruption differently, it has vulnerabilities like its export driven economy. In practice, most major powers hedge. China may not want the US hyper-focused on it, but uncontrollable chaos in the global system could still carry unintended consequences. Even relative winners of chaos sometimes lose control of the outcomes. But I fully get your point. Some might view chaos as a tool if they think they can shape it. Let's hope cooler heads see stability as a shared interest eventually.
It's not about hopeful thinking, it's about realistic thinking. If we look at the arsenal of Iran and its own capability, I highly doubt that the Iranians have developed all of that by themselves. We can, of course, agree that the Russians have helped them. However, I do believe that with all the materials that they have been using in order to develop their arsenal, I do believe that the Chinese have been backing them as well. And the Chinese must have known that Iran is an agent of chaos within the region. And if they have been backing them, that's because they obviously expect for the current outcome and they support it. Um, which, I mean, at the end of the day, you cannot guarantee anything in this world, but I believe that more likely the Chinese interest is support Iran beneath the table, pretty much, not outwardly, because they don't want a direct confrontation against the United States. They're smarter than that, but I do believe beneath the table, it's actually served them to support Iran. Yes, you have highlighted a very important point, which is no one can guarantee an outcome, and we live in a world of uncertainty. However, at the end of the day, governments must make decisions in a world of uncertainty. And I do believe this is, from a logical perspective, China's best decision.
You're absolutely right that states must strategize in uncertainty, and you're presenting a logical chain of reasoning. It's true that historically, powers often support proxies to shift balances. Whether China is directly doing so is speculative, but your broader point stands. Major powers calculate risks, sometimes preferring indirect methods. Still, all sides will keep reassessing outcomes. Even if one path seems logical now, evolving realities might shift those calculations. In any case, thoughtful analysis like yours helps us grapple with these complex realities.
However, the question now is what is the expected end outcome? I do believe the United States anti rocket arsenal will deplete sooner than Iran's, I believe, a huge arsenal of rockets. And I highly doubt that the United States will be able to dismantle their rocket systems, even though the United States control Iran's airspace. So that give Iran a huge power or a huge leverage, let's say. Um, the question is how the war will end, and I do believe that the United States will be forced to leave the region for the simple reason that its current existence within the region is conditioned upon two variables. The first variable is its a security guarantee for the region, and the second one is oil. Oil, the idea that it allow and guarantee access of oil to the world. And if the United States fails in these two conditions, I do believe that it will pressure the region's power, the GCC, and that is actually Iran's, I do believe, main goal within the GCC, to pressure the countries to pretty much ask the United States to leave the region. Now, knowing Israel's direct interest in destroying Iran's regime, one question arises, which is, will Israel use nuclear weapons against Iran? I highly doubt that de-escalation and peace talks is a realistic option from a probability standpoint.
I understand why you see escalation risks, given how entrenched the interests are. That said, nuclear use is widely viewed as a last resort scenario, even for Israel, due to global fallout, political and literal. The US withdrawal you mention is plausible if the costs outweigh perceived benefits, though it'd reshape alliances and markets. Still, it's not certain. Regional powers often prefer US balance to avoid being caught between rivals. In reality, conflicts evolve. Even hawkish players sometimes shift when costs mount. While peace talks might seem unlikely now, history shows that even bitter foes eventually find reasons to negotiate, even if not soon.
Yeah, but highlighting important talks to support the notion that peace is more likely. I mean, at the end of the day, everything is a matter of likelihood. However, I do believe the more likely scenario is for things to continue to escalate due to what I have highlighted.
You're right, likelihoods are what we're really weighing here. And I respect your reasoning. Escalation risks are real, especially when parties feel existential stakes. While I can't guarantee a peaceful off ramp, I just add that sometimes unintended consequences, economic shocks, domestic pressure, have a way of forcing de escalation even when no one wants it up front. That's not optimism, just acknowledging history's twists. But I hear you. Right now, the trajectory is uncertain, and the risks are certainly high.
Well, here's the thing from an economical perspective, once Iran gained the leverage over GCC countries, Iran can threaten to attack their civilian infrastructure, and these countries are highly dependent on they don't have their own rivers, they don't have access to fresh water, for example. Their food access is highly dependent from import from external from other countries. So if Iran threatened to cut or destroy their water desalination factories, in addition to prevent them from importing food from outside countries, that will uh, be a huge factor in pressuring them to kick the United States out. So I do believe economy actually is within the interest of Iran, is not actually because Iran can threaten all of these countries that it will destroy their infrastructure, especially after the United States anti-rocket system get depleted, which I think is what will happen most likely.
I see where you're coming from. Iran's leverage would indeed increase if it could convincingly threaten vital infrastructure in the Gulf. Yet, while such threats cause pressure, these nations also invest heavily in defense and alliances precisely to deter such scenarios. I'd say while Iran might hope for that leverage, actual escalation to widespread regional infrastructure attacks would be a dangerous last resort. The US, GCC, and even global markets would react strongly. So, yes, the scenario is conceivable, but it would be a high stakes gamble for all sides.
Yes, but I ha- but take note that Iran is currently depleting the entire stock of anti-rocket systems. I mean, from a rational standpoint, Iran's attack on Americans' bases does not provide it with any meaningful advantage. Killing a few American soldiers, destroying some vehicles, it is meaningless. I do believe that the main purpose of Iran's current attack on the GCC countries is one particular objective, which is to deplete the American system. Because once the American anti-rocket system is depleted, Iran gained tremendous leverage.
It's clear you're thinking deeply about leverage and attrition strategies. You're right that exhausting defensive systems could shift balances temporarily. But remember, the US and its allies have deep logistical supply chains. While no system is infinite, the US adapts and reinforces. Iran would need to sustain intense pressure, which carries its own risks. In any scenario, leverage isn't just military. Economic, political, and diplomatic responses follow. While Iran might hope to gain an edge, real world escalation often triggers countermeasures. So while depletion could shift dynamics, it wouldn't guarantee a decisive, unchecked advantage. Still, you're right that attrition strategies are a key part of modern conflicts.
Yeah, if the United States end up having to take its stockpile from other regions, it will actually weaken its position in the East Asian region, which pretty much give China an opening window to attack Taiwan. So I think that's why it's an additional point of why the matter served China. Because if China seeks to strengthen its position and take Taiwan, which will uh, allow it to gain access to to the key chip industry within Taiwan, which will strengthen its position dramatically. I do believe weakening America within the region serves it. So that even add to the point that China will actually gonna support Iran under the table, even though publicly it will pretend not to do so.
You've outlined a complex, interconnected scenario that definitely highlights how global rivalries are intertwined. It's true that a US focus in one region stretches its global commitments, and any prolonged entanglement could create windows of opportunity elsewhere. Still, actions like taking Taiwan are enormously risky for China, and states weigh these risks carefully. The bottom line? Global rivalries involve layered strategies, but each step comes with risks of unintended escalation. You've painted a compelling scenario, and these complexities are precisely why these situations are so fraught. In the end, every player will keep recalculating as realities shift.
True. Taking into consideration everything that I have said, what do you think is the more likely scenario?
I think the most likely scenario in the short to medium term is neither a quick peace nor all out victory. Instead, you might see prolonged, uneasy deterrence. Both sides could escalate to gain leverage, but likely avoid absolute extremes like nuclear use or global chaos. Iran might leverage pressure, and the US will try to reinforce deterrence. China will watch, weighing opportunity against risk. In essence, the most probable outcome is a tense, ongoing power contest, neither immediate collapse nor quick resolution, but a drawn out balancing act.
However, a prolonged war actually will lead to the destruction of the world economy for the simple reason that if Iran continue to prevent oil from, which is Iran's best thing to do right now, prevent oil from being exported to the world, this will lead to a global economical catastrophe.
You're right that a prolonged The conflict involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz has added a risk premium to global oil prices, raising them by a few percent recently. Complete closure of the strait could push oil to $110 to $130 per barrel, potentially risking global recession. In a moderate scenario with partial disruption, prices might rise to $80 or $90. For now, the situation is raising volatility, but hasn't yet caused a full-blown global oil crisis.
Yes, but since you have agreed that the most likely scenarios for the world to continue, then that will lead to oil prices and gas prices to continue to rise, which will lead to a huge economical downfall.
The prolonged conflict involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is already raising oil prices, with Brent crude recently around $81 per barrel, and further disruptions could push it to 100 or even 150. A severe supply disruption could increase inflation by about 1 percentage point and reduce global growth, potentially risking recession. In less severe cases, oil might rise to around $90 to $100, raising inflation and slowing growth moderately. Overall, prolonged disruption would stress global economies significantly.
You don't believe that within few months this will lead to a huge recession, a recession pretty much, which is what I believe is the most likely scenario.
If the conflict leads to a prolonged disruption of oil from the Strait of Hormuz, a global recession could become likely within a few months. In the first month, oil prices might spike 10 to 15%, increasing inflation. If prices remain above $100 per barrel for 3 to 6 months, recession risks could rise to around 60%. In short, if disruption lasts, the global economy would face significant pressure by 2027.
And you agree that that is the most likely scenario to happen.
I wouldn't say it's the most likely scenario outright. It's certainly a risk if escalation continues unchecked. But we should remember how resilient global systems can be. Historically, even major oil shocks sparked policy responses, from alternative supplies to diplomacy. So while recession is a plausible scenario if disruption persists, I think most likely depends on how states adapt. In short, it's a serious possibility, but not a foregone conclusion.
It is true, but this time is different because this time the system is facing attack from um, multiple attacking point. Pretty much the war in Russia, the war in Middle East, Trump's disruption with Trump's tariffs, for example, and other variables. The system is being attacked from multiple points, and I think that the system's response mechanisms have been exhausted for the simple reason that all major countries, their debt to GDP by far or exceeds their debt exceeds their own GDP pretty much percentage wise. Um, so their arsenal of responses have been exhausted, and the continuous attack will lead most likely to the breaking of the system.
It's true that global systems are under strain from multiple fronts: geopolitical tensions, inflation, and debt. But historically, even when the global economy faces compounding shocks, nations adapt through policy shifts, alliances, or restructuring. While risks are real, systemic collapse is rare. Tools like debt restructuring, stimulus, or cooperation may still emerge. So while you foresee a severe breaking point, it's also possible the system evolves, maybe painfully, but not inevitably breaking. In short, the situation is serious, but responses might still shape outcomes before total collapse.
Can you give examples of how the system might adapt or overcome these points of attack?
Sure. Historically, when oil shocks occurred, nations diversified energy sources, investing more in renewables or strategic reserves. Trade disruptions have led to new alliances or regional trade blocs, ensuring critical supplies. When debt to GDP soared, countries have restructured debt, reformed fiscal policies, or coordinated global interventions. Even rivalries sometimes pause for pragmatic talks. None of these are painless, but their health systems have adapted before and could again.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. It was a thoughtful conversation. Anytime you want to dig into something, I'm here. Take care.